Welcome to episode 4 of Rise of a Nation, South America. This episode is on Suriname.
Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're taking a journey, really, a chronological look through the history of Suriname. We'll trace it all the way from its earliest people right up to what's happening now.
Yeah, the idea is to give you a clear picture of the big moments, the sort of forces that have really shaped the country.
Exactly. So for sources, we've got a YouTube transcript that gives a good political overview, and then some Wikipedia deep dives on, specific times and key figures, like Desi Bouterse, for instance.
Right. We're piecing it together to map out that whole historical path.
Okay, so our mission here is to light up those key turning points, the things that made Suriname what it is today. Let's jump right in at the beginning. Where do we start?
Well, the very earliest history, we're talking settlements back around 3000 BCE.
Yeah.
Native American groups were the first ones there.
3000 BCE, wow.
Yeah. Then, much later, Europeans started showing up. Spanish explorers, Dutch traders. They visited the coast, which they often called the Wild Coast.
The Wild Coast. And the Dutch actually set up shop pretty early, didn't they, around 1613?
They did, yeah. A couple of trading posts, one near a place the locals called Paramaribo on the Suriname River.
Okay.
And another one briefly on the Quarantine River, though the Spanish took that one over pretty quickly, the same year, actually.
So not exactly smooth sailing for these early European ventures.
Not at all. The sources really stress there was significant resistance from the indigenous people. That made it, less attractive for serious European settlement at first. What's kind of interesting is how European focus then sort of shifted eastward towards Suriname. Part of that was actually Sir Walter Raleigh.
Oh, El Dorado guy.
That's him. His, let's say, exaggerated stories about the mythical city of gold. Even though people initially thought El Dorado was further west, the whole legend kind of pulled European attention towards the Guianas generally.
So the lure of gold, even if mythical, played a part in drawing eyes to Suriname. Okay, so what about the first real attempts to settle down, to colonize?
Right. The first sort of major European try was by the English, led by a Captain Marshall in 1630. They tried growing tobacco.
Tobacco, okay. How did that go?
It failed. Financially, just didn't work out.
Yeah.
Then the French had a small outpost near the Suriname River mouth around 1640.
But still facing challenges.
Big time. That native resistance was still a major hurdle. It just made it really tough to build anything lasting or profitable early on.
Right. So it seems like it needed a more concerted effort. Which brings us to the English colony of Suriname, mid-17th century. What was different this time?
Well, this was the first permanent European settlement established by the British around 1651. They built it near where Paramaribo was, basically, and called the Fort Willoughby.
Fort Willoughby. And the goal this time?
Sugar. They wanted a new sugar colony, maybe like an alternative to Barbados, which was already booming.
Ah, okay. So they brought in experienced people.
Yeah, the first colonists included planters straight from Barbados who knew the sugar business.
And it wasn't just the English involved.
No, that's interesting, too. They were joined by Sephardic Jewish planters who came from Cayenne, and also quite a few Sephardic Jewish refugees from Brazil.
Refugees. Why from Brazil?
They were fleeing after the Portuguese kicked the Dutch out of Brazil in 1649. So they came to Suriname.
Got it. So the colony starts growing.
It does. It expands to about 30,000 acres, all centered around Fort Willoughby. By 1663, you've got maybe 50 plantations.
And who was working these plantations?
A mix, initially. Native Indians and also about 3,000 enslaved Africans. The European population was around 1,000. And notably, the English did grant religious freedom to those Brazilian Jews who settled there.
Seems like a functioning colony under the English. But the Dutch weren't out of the picture for long.
Definitely not. War broke out between Britain and the Netherlands, and in February 1667, the Dutch just sailed in and conquered the colony.
Oh, just like that?
Pretty much.
Right.
Led by Abraham Trenson, they renamed Fort Willoughby to Fort Zeelandia.
Fort Zeelandia. But that wasn't the end of the story for 1667, was it? There was a treaty.
Right, the Treaty of Breda. Really crucial moment. It basically confirmed the wartime gains.
So who got what?
The Dutch kept Suriname, and the English got New Netherland.
Which is now New York.
Exactly. The treaty was signed in July 67, and it was meant to sort of calm down the commercial fighting between England and the Dutch Republic, even led to a temporary alliance.
Temporary alliance, maybe, but Suriname stayed Dutch.
Well, mostly. The English actually recaptured it briefly later in 67, but then the Treaty of Westminster in 1674 made the swap permanent. And that basically set up Dutch rule for like 3 centuries.
3 centuries, wow. So how did the Dutch organize things once it was firmly theirs?
They reorganized in 1683. They created something called the Society of Suriname.
The Society of Suriname sounds official. What was it?
It was essentially a private company, but with 3 equal partners sharing the control.
Okay, who are the partners?
The City of Amsterdam, the Dutch West India Company, and the family of this nobleman, Cornelis van Aersen van Sommelsdijk.
Van Aersen, right? And he actually went there.
He did. He became governor in 1683. He tried to get more people to migrate, made peace with some indigenous groups, boosted the military, but it didn't end well for him.
Oh, what happened?
He was murdered in 1688 by his own soldiers, actually. They mutinied over pay and conditions.
Yikes. A rough start to permanent Dutch rule. But the colony did eventually prosper, especially in the 18th century.
Oh, yeah. The 18th century was the boom time, really. Sugar, coffee, cocoa, cotton, huge production on the plantations.
All shipped back to Europe.
Yep, mostly through Amsterdam. Made Suriname very valuable for the Dutch.
But this value, this prosperity, it came at a terrible cost. Let's talk about slavery.
Absolutely fundamental and absolutely horrific. The whole plantation system depended entirely on the forced labor of enslaved Africans, and the conditions were just brutal.
And there was resistance from the very beginning.
Always. Many enslaved people escaped. They fled into the jungle, the interior, and set up their own independent communities. These were the Maroons.
The Maroons, a really important part of Suriname's story.
Hugely important. They didn't just hide away. They often raided plantations to free others, especially women, and to get supplies, weapons, things they needed.
Were there famous Maroon leaders?
Yes. Figures like Billy, and also Fubon. Fubon's considered the sort of father of the Iluku people. He actually died fighting the Dutch in 1793. His descendants, the Iluku, are now a distinct group, mostly in French Guiana.
So the planters had to deal with this constant threat. How did they respond?
They used military force, sent expeditions into the jungle, but they also, interestingly, made peace treaties with some of the larger Maroon groups.
Treaties.
Yeah, with the Ndukas in 1761 and the Saramacans in 1762. Basically, the Dutch recognized their autonomy, let them live freely in the interior in exchange for the Maroons stopping the raids.
Did these raids and the treaties have a wider economic impact?
Oh, definitely. The constant Maroon attacks really shook confidence in the colony's stability. And then on top of that, there was a big financial crisis in Amsterdam.
How did that affect Suriname?
It cut off the credit line. The whole plantation economy ran on credit, often using the estates themselves as collateral. So when the money from Amsterdam dried up, it hit the colony.
So a lot of turmoil towards the end of the 18th century. And then the British pop up again.
They do. In 1799, the Netherlands itself had been basically taken over by France, so the British occupied Suriname.
But just temporarily.
Right. After Napoleon was defeated, it went back to the Dutch in 1816. It's worth noting, though, the British had actually abolished the slave trade during their occupation, something the Dutch hadn't done yet.
When did the Dutch finally abolish slavery itself in Suriname?
Not until 1863, quite a bit later than the British.
And was it immediate freedom?
Not exactly. There was this 10-year transition period called state supervision.
Meaning
The formerly enslaved people still had to work under contract for the planters. They got paid wages, but they weren't completely free to leave.
And the planters got compensation.
They did. The Dutch government paid them 300 guilders for each person freed.
Abolition must have caused a massive shift in the labor situation.
Huge. Suddenly, there's a big labor shortage on the plantations.
So how did they fill the gap?
They started bringing in indentured laborers from lots of places, actually. China, Portugal, mostly Madeira, starting in 1853. Then a lot from British India between 1873 and 1914. And also from Java in the Dutch East Indies, starting in 1890.
Indentured labor. So they worked under contract for a set time.
Exactly. And while many stayed, significant numbers, especially the Indian and Javanese workers, actually went back home after their contracts were up.
With all these changes in labor, did the economy itself start to change too? Did sugar stay king?
It started to lose its crown, you could say. After slavery ended, sugar exports declined. There were several reasons.
Like what?
Well, the Suez Canal opened, changing trade routes. European countries gave preferential tariffs to other sugar producers. And maybe the biggest thing was competition from beet sugar grown in Europe itself. By the early 20th century, sugar wasn't nearly as dominant.
So what replaced it? What drove the economy next?
Well, there were some ups and downs with other tropical crops. But then gold. Gold mining started in the 1870s over in the Law area.
Was it a big rush?
It was significant for a while. The colonial government encouraged it, gave out concessions, even built a railway from Paramaribo out to the gold fields, finished in 1912. But the gold production actually started falling off by around 1915.
Okay, so gold was maybe not the long-term answer. What came next?
Bauxite, aluminium ore. Deposits were found in 1915 by an American geologist.
Ah, bauxite. That became important.
Hugely important, especially with World War I driving demand. In 1917, an American company, the Suriname Bauxite Company, started production. And by the 1930s, bauxite was easily the main export. It stayed that way for decades.
Sugar, then gold, then bauxite. You can really track the economic shifts. Okay, let's move into the 20th century proper and the road towards independence.
Right. So after the shift to bauxite, you get the Great Depression in the 1930s. That hit Suriname hard, like everywhere. Unemployment, unrest.
And political resistance starting to grow.
Definitely. This is when a really key figure emerges. Anton de Kom, who's a major anti-colonial voice, very popular.
What happened to him?
The colonial authorities saw him as a threat. In 1933, there was a protest demanding his release after he'd been arrested, and the police actually shot and killed 2 of his supporters. Shortly after that, de Kom was deported.
Wow. Shows the tension building. Then World War II comes along. How did that impact things?
Well, economically, it caused a bit of a boom because bauxite was so critical for the war effort, especially for airplanes.
Right.
But politically, it also seemed to speed up the push for more autonomy, maybe even independence.
How so?
After the war, things started moving faster. A new constitution in 1948 gave Suriname more self-rule within the Kingdom of the Netherlands. Then the first proper election was in 1949. Julius Caesar de Miranda became the first prime minister.
So steps towards self-government.
Exactly. And then a bigger step in 1954. Suriname gained full self-government internally. The Netherlands still handled defense and foreign policy, but domestically, Suriname was running its own affairs.
Okay, so self-governing but not independent yet. What led to that final break?
A few things were happening in the 60s and early 70s. In the Netherlands itself, support was growing for letting the colonies go.
Why the change of heart in the Netherlands?
Well, it was costing money to maintain them. Some felt Dutch influence wasn't what it used to be anyway, and, ideas about colonialism were changing globally. Plus, there was unrest in the territories themselves. Riots in Suriname and Curaçao in 1969 really highlighted the tensions.
And migration played a role too.
Yeah, quite a big one. A lot of Surinamese people were moving to the Netherlands, which put a strain on Dutch social services. That kind of made independence look like a more practical solution for the Dutch government, too.
Interesting. A mix of internal pressures and external calculations. How did Suriname manage the actual transition?
The government in Suriname at the time, led by Henk Aaron and dominated by Creole politicians, declared in 1973 that they'd leave the kingdom before the end of '76.
Was everyone on board with that?
Not entirely. The main party representing the Indo-Surinamese population, the VHP, had reservations. But independence went ahead anyway.
When was the official date?
November 25th, 1975. Johan Ferrier became the first president. Henk Aaron stayed on as prime minister.
A historic day, but also a time of uncertainty.
Definitely. A lot of people, maybe a third of the population eventually, actually emigrated to the Netherlands around independence, worried about the country's future, its economic viability.
So independence achieved, but then just 5 years later, a major shock, the 1980 military coup.
Yeah, a huge turning point. February 25th, 1980. A group of 16 non-commissioned officers, sergeants mainly, led by Desi Bouterse, overthrew the elected government.
What was their reason, or their stated reason?
The trigger was apparently the government refusing to recognize a trade union for soldiers. But, there were deeper dissatisfactions. Interestingly, the coup initially had some popular support. People hoped it might mean less corruption, maybe better economic management.
But those hopes didn't last long.
No. The military set up a national council, imposed curfews, clamped down on the press. They promised democracy back in 2 years, but things went downhill fast.
Economically.
Yeah, the economy really suffered. Foreign aid, especially from the Dutch, was cut. Investment dried up. Bauxite exports fell. And then this sort of revolutionary front emerged within the military regime, talking about a socialist state, which scared a lot of people and boosted opposition.
And then came one of the darkest chapters, the December murders in 1982.
Just horrific. 15 leading opposition figures, lawyers, journalists, academics, union leaders were rounded up, taken to Fort Zeelandia, tortured, and executed by Wassis's regime.
The reaction must have been strong.
Immediate condemnation. The Netherlands and the U.S. completely suspended aid. It isolated the regime. Then a few years later, in 1986, things got even worse with the start of the Surinamese Interior War.
What was that?
It was a guerrilla conflict, a maroon group, the Jungle Commando, led by Ronnie Brunswick.
Wait, Brunswick, wasn't he connected to Busis?
He was. He'd been Busis's personal bodyguard. Now they were enemies. Brunswick's group started attacking army posts.
And the government's response?
Brutal. Really harsh counterinsurgency. Villages destroyed, civilians killed or forced to flee, especially Maroons. The Moiwana massacre in 1986 was part of this.
Just chaos and violence. How did Suriname ever get back to civilian rule?
It took a lot of international pressure. Eventually, the military allowed elections in 1987. A civilian government came in.
Okay, so democracy restored.
Well, not quite so simple. That civilian government tried to make peace with Brunswick's Jungle Commando. The military didn't like that, and in 1990 there was another coup. Bloodless this time, they called it the telephone coup.
Another coup. Unbelievable.
Yeah. But again, more international pressure. So new elections in 1991, Ronald Venetian became president, and his government did finally sign a peace deal with the Jungle Commando in 1992, ending the Interior War.
But Buser himself, he didn't just vanish.
Far from it. Even with civilian rule back, Buser's remained a major player. He had already founded his own political party, the NDP, back in 1987. He stayed very influential.
Despite everything, including legal troubles abroad.
Yes. In 1999, he was actually convicted in the Netherlands, in absentia, for drug trafficking, sentenced to 11 years.
And the December murders case.
That finally went to trial in Suriname starting in 2007, a very long process.
Which sets the scene for something remarkable. Bouter's actually becoming president in 2010.
Astonishing, really, given his past. He was elected president by the National Assembly in 2010 and then re-elected in 2015.
A deeply controversial presidency, I imagine.
Extremely. He did things like officially honoring the guys involved in the 1980 coup. He appointed people suspected in the December murders to high office, and there were constant accusations he was trying to interfere with the judiciary, especially regarding his own trial.
Didn't he try to pass an amnesty law for the December murders?
He did in 2012. His coalition pushed through an amnesty law. It caused a huge uproar, nationally and internationally. The Dutch suspended aid again. But eventually, Suriname's own courts overturned that amnesty law.
So the trial continued, and he was eventually convicted.
Yes. After years and years, he was finally convicted in 2019 for his role in the December murders. The conviction and a 20-year sentence were upheld on appeal in 2023.
And he was also linked to the Moiwana massacre.
Suspected of involvement, yes, though not formally charged in the same way as the December murders. His time as president also saw, ongoing economic problems, falling commodity prices, and this persistent issue of a huge underground economy, drug trafficking, illegal gold mining.
And then the very final twist in the Bouter saga came quite recently.
Indeed. Chan Santoki won the election in 2020, replacing Bouters. When Bouters' final appeal failed in late 2023, and he was supposed to report to prison in January 2024, he just disappeared, went into hiding.
A fugitive.
Exactly. Until December 23rd, 2024, when news broke that he had died while still in hiding.
How did he die?
The official autopsy said liver failure, apparently due to chronic alcohol use. There was no state funeral, no national mourning declared by the government.
A really tumultuous end to a very long and controversial career. So where does that leave Suriname now, moving forward?
Well, there's some cautious optimism. There have been major offshore oil discoveries recently, which could be transformative, though managing that wealth is always a challenge. The economy has seen some modest recovery.
We're still facing challenges.
Oh, absolutely. The legacy of the past is heavy. Building trust, strengthening institutions, tackling corruption and the illicit economy, ensuring development benefits everyone. It's a complex road ahead. The transition is definitely uncertain.
So, wrapping up this deep dive, it's been quite a journey through Suriname's history, from those very first inhabitants, through Dutch colonization, the horrors of slavery, the resilience of the Maroons.
The long path to independence, and then these really dramatic cycles of political instability, violence, but also periods of trying to build democracy, often dominated by this one figure, Bouters.
You really see how external forces, from European powers to global markets, have constantly shaped its path. Colonialism, the Cold War implicitly, commodity prices.
And internal struggles, too. Ethnic tensions, the fight for resources, the battle between authoritarianism and democracy. It's all woven together.
It is. And it leaves you thinking, despite this incredibly complex and often tragic past, Suriname does seem to be at another potential turning point now.
Yeah, these oil discoveries are a huge opportunity, but also a risk if not managed well. There's still this ongoing effort to consolidate democracy, deal with the ghosts of the past, like the December murders conviction finally sticking.
It really feels like the choices being made right now by the government, by the people, will be crucial in shaping whether that hope for a truly better, more stable future can finally be achieved. Something to watch, definitely.
For sure.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into Suriname.
Thank you for watching episode 4 of Rise of a Nation, South America. If you enjoyed this podcast, please like and subscribe for more. Write in the comments what country's rise you would like me to cover next.